Good evening, brothers and sisters. Apologies for the long reading, but I think it's quite interesting and probably quite relevant. So, in Hebrew, Jonathan is Yehonatan or Yonatan, which means literally Yahweh has given. And in Israel, you'll often hear people called Yoni, which is short for Yonatan. But we're going to stick with the English pronunciation for tonight. But the Jonathan we're thinking about is actually the first known use of the name. So there were two key figures in Jonathan's life: Saul, his father, and David, his best friend. Saul, of course, was the first king of Israel, and he was chosen by God when the people demanded a king. So if we turn to 1st of Samuel and chapter 9, we read, "There was a man of Benjamin whose name was Kish, the son of Abiel, the son of Zeror, the son of Behorath, the son of Aphia, a Benjamite, a mighty man of power. And he had a choice and handsome son whose name was Saul. There was not a more handsome person than he among the children of Israel. From his shoulders upwards, he was taller than any of the people." And I'm reading from the New King James Version. So I'm stating the obvious here, but we've got to bear in mind that there were no media, there were no newspapers, there were no photographs. So if you had a celebrity, it would be created by word of mouth. And the fact is, Saul was very memorable. He was incredibly handsome and very tall. So even if you'd not met him, and perhaps it didn't even know his name, you would have heard about him. And he would be the kind of person you would imagine when you were thinking about a king. Verse 20, Samuel says to Saul, "And on whom is all the desire of Israel? Is it not on you and on all your father's house?" So Saul was the people's choice. However, in the next chapter, we read in verse 24, "And Samuel said to all the people, do you see him whom the Lord has chosen, that there is no one like him among all the people?" So not only is Saul people's choice, but he's God's choice. But we know, of course, that things didn't end well with Saul, did they? And it makes you wonder, was he chosen to fail? Well, I don't think he was. I think he had the ability to be a good king. He showed that initially with what he did initially when his people demanded to kill those that were in opposition to him. And he said, no one's going to die today. The trouble is, he had free will. And of course, we can make the wrong choices. So Saul was a warrior king, and he cemented his authority by defeating the Ammonites. And we skip forward 2 years into his reign, and we find him in conflict with the Philistines. And he has all the people together, but he selects an elite fighting force of 3,000 men. He leads 2,000 of them, and Jonathan, his son, leads 1,000. And this is the first mention we have of Jonathan. And what's not clear, well, I think it does become clear later, but what's not clear is whether Jonathan was operating on his own or whether it was a plan. But Jonathan attacked a Philistine garrison, and this provoked an overwhelming response. The Philistines responded with 6,000 horsemen and 3,000 chariots. Now, The authorized version says 300,000 chariots, but most commentators agree that this was actually 3,000. And faced with this overwhelming response, Israel flees, and the people hide themselves in caves and in thickets and in rocks and in high places and in pits. And so there's a stalemate. And it seems that at this time, the capital was Gilgal, and this is where Saul is. And he'd arranged to meet with Samuel in 7 days. The trouble was, 7 days had gone by and Samuel had not appeared. And the situation seems desperate. The people are terrified. They have no weapons, but they're surrounded by hostile Philistines ready to attack. So no wonder Saul is anxious. And he sees the only way out as being God's help. But Samuel has not turned up to do the sacrifice. So Saul does it himself, which is a big mistake. And Samuel said to Saul, "You have done foolishly. You have not kept the commandment of the Lord your God, which he commanded you. For now the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever. But now your kingdom shall not continue. The Lord has sought for himself a man after his own heart, and the Lord has commanded him to be a commander over his people, because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you." This seems harsh, doesn't it? I mean, we know that Saul was usurping Samuel's authority. He was the king. He wasn't supposed to be a priest. He was not a king priest after the order of Melchizedek. We know that's Christ's role. But I think it's actually a little bit more than that. Let's carry on with the story. We'll return to what's going on in a moment. So following Samuel's condemnation, Saul's force melts away. From the original 3,000, it's reduced to 600 men. And in the chapter we read, we find Jonathon bored with the inactivity. They're just sitting there waiting for the Philistines to attack. And Jonathon says to his armor bearer, what we'd probably call a squire, he says, "Come, let us go over to the garrison of these uncircumcised. It may be that the Lord will work for us. For nothing restrains the Lord by saving by many or by few." And this tells us a lot about Jonathon's faith, his understanding of God's power. The two men crawled up on hands and knees to the Philistine garrison. And the Philistines clearly were not expecting them. And their shock tactics killed 20 men and it caused panic. And this was added to by God through an earthquake, wasn't it? But we've read this chapter, haven't we? Well, most of this chapter. And it ends with Israel ready to rebel against Saul, who's going to kill Jonathon. So how did we end up here? Well, when Israel demanded a king, it was to lead them against their enemies. And initially, Saul did that and was victorious against the Ammonites. But 2 years later, Israel is under the thumb of the Philistines. They have no weapons and no blacksmiths. In fact, they have to go to the Philistines just to have their agricultural implements sharpened so that they can't fight the Philistines. So what has happened? Saul hasn't led his people against the Philistines, has he? He seems afraid of them. And he disbands his army. He cuts it down to 3,000 men. Why? Is it so that it doesn't appear to be a threat to the Philistines? Because we know they've got a much bigger force. But then Jonathan messes it all up, doesn't he? He attacks the Philistine garrison, and guess who gets the blame? It's Saul, isn't it? They blame Saul. And in response, the Philistines gather a huge force, and the Israelites hide in fear. So Saul is terrified and sends for Samuel, who says he will come to offer a sacrifice in 7 days. 7 days pass, and Samuel doesn't appear. Saul panics and offers the sacrifice himself, usurping Samuel's authority. Saul is condemned and told because of his actions, the throne will be taken from him and from his family. And I think in Saul's mind, it was all Jonathan's fault. Yet again, it was Jonathan that forced the issue. We've just read how he and his armor bearer attacked the Philistines, and he made Saul join in the fight. And when Saul was going to have Jonathan executed, he found himself not only in opposition to God, but also his people. And they were ready to rebel. So Saul's not really fulfilling his role. He's not really a good king. He's not leading his people. Because when we next meet Jonathan, Saul is again cowering in fear of the Philistines. And this time, it's Goliath who's scaring him. And Goliath, of course, was a giant. But Saul, we know Saul was head and shoulders above everyone else. So clearly it was him who should have faced Goliath. And when we look at this story, we start to wonder, why didn't Jonathan face Goliath? His previous actions, the passage we read, show his faith and trust in God. So did Saul stop him? Did he forbid him from facing Goliath? Or did his faith fail this time? Or, like everyone else, was he terrified of the giant Philistine? And we know the story, of course. We know that David, although a youth and untrained in the ways of war, defeated Goliath. So in 1 Samuel chapter 18, verse 1, we read about after David had killed Goliath. Now, when he had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. So, prior to killing Goliath, David had actually been part of Saul's court. The thing is, he was an unknown, unnamed musician who had been hired to play when Saul was suffering from bouts of depression. He was only there part-time, and he was able to return home regularly. But after he had killed Goliath, everyone knew who he was, and he had to stay at the royal court. So 1 Samuel chapter 18, verses 3 to 4. Then Jonathan and David made a covenant because he loved him as his own soul. And Jonathan took off the robe that was on him and gave it to David with his armor, even to his sword and his bow and his belt. Now, we know that this relationship between Jonathan and David is talked about a lot, that some people have tried to say that it was an intimate sexual relationships. And this isn't helped by many of the artists that depict the two men being gay themselves. And you end up with homoerotic images. David and Saul appear to be very don't know what you would say, very fey, very not what they were, which were men of war. Well, Jonathan was definitely a man of war, and David was a rugged shepherd boy. And if you start looking at the images of them, you find that most of these images don't portray them like that. Of course, it doesn't help that Oscar Wilde talked about David and Jonathan at his trial. We know, of course, that we can dismiss this idea immediately. Samuel told Saul that God had chosen a man after his own heart, after God's own heart. That man, of course, was David. The law of Moses tells us that sex between two men is abhorrent and that it is to be punished by death. So how could David be in a gay marriage, a gay relationship, and be a man after God's own heart? It's impossible, isn't it? And the word knit, where it says the soul of Jonathan knit to the soul of David, it doesn't actually have any kind of romantic connotations. The word is korshar, and it means bound together, in league together, to conspire together. In other words, they were inseparable. They were thick as thieves. They were co-conspirators. We know all the English phrases, don't we? And the idea of the covenant. Of course, covenant is a word we are very familiar with. And it's an agreement, isn't it, a covenant? And it's agreement usually between a stronger and a weaker party. We know of covenants between God and man, between the king and his subjects. In this case, it's a covenant between Jonathan, who is the older one, who is a royal prince, who is the heir to the throne, and David, a young shepherd and a musician. And when we read about Jonathan giving David his robe, his armour, his sword and belt, we kind of read it because of their friendship. That is possible, of course, but there are other possibilities. David had just killed Goliath, and he had been told, the man who killeth him, the king will enrich him with great riches, and will give him his daughter, and will make his father's house free in Israel. If we think about the book of Esther, King Ahasuerus, had Mordecai dressed in the king's own robe and paraded on his horse. So possibly this could have been part of the reward for David for killing Goliath. So David started as an unnamed musician, but he became a resident of the royal court, and he was trained as a military commander. And he had Jonathan as his mentor, as the one who looked after him. And some commentators point out that the symbolism of passing on the robe, that possibly Jonathan gave David his robe in the same way that Aaron's garments were passed on to Eleazar, his son, to show, or even Elijah put his cloak on Elisha, showing a passing on of authority, that perhaps Jonathan understood what David's role was going to be and was showing that he accepted this passing on of authority. I think, however, it was possibly a little bit soon for that, but it's worth bearing in mind. So we know that David became popular with the people, with the royal courtiers. He married Michal, Saul's daughter. He became Jonathan's brother-in-law. He became part of the family. And of course, we know that Saul became very jealous of David's success, of his popularity. And this made the friendship between David and Jonathan very difficult. And when Saul wanted to kill David, Jonathan pleaded for him, and he changed his father's mind. But of course, this didn't last. And in 1st of Samuel, chapter 20, is the most famous story of all of the firing of the arrows. David says that Saul, Jonathan's father, is trying to kill him, but Jonathan says, "By no means, you shall not die. Indeed, my father will do nothing, either great or small, without first telling me. And why should my father hide this from me? It is not so." And this tells us a few things about Jonathan. They may have been a little bit shaky earlier on, but here he appears to be close to Saul, to be Saul's confidant. But he doesn't actually know him as well as he thinks he does. In verse 13, we'll read, "And the Lord be with you as he has been with my father. And you shall not only show me the kindness of the Lord while I live, that I may not die, but you shall not cut off your kindness from my house forever. No, not when the Lord has cut off every one of the enemies of David from the face of the earth." So Jonathan made a covenant with the house of David. So Jonathan, at this stage, definitely knows that David is going to be king, that David is going to take Jonathan's place on the throne. Now, I don't know about you, but I get resentful of people taking the smallest of things I think should be mine. But Jonathan knew that he was going to have to lose his life so that David would get the throne. But Jonathan doesn't show any resentment, but he asks David not to hasten this by killing him himself, and that when he has gone, to look after his family. And we know, of course, about Mephibosheth, don't we? Jonathan's lame son, who David, what really, by all the normal practices, should have killed, because Mephibosheth was Jonathan's son. He had a claim to the throne. But David took him and showed him kindness and made him part of his own family and treated him like his own son. But it's interesting, isn't it? Because when we first looked at David and Jonathan getting together, it was Jonathan who was the authority figure. He was the older one. He was the royal prince. But the balance of power has now shifted. And David now makes a covenant with Jonathan. So Jonathan is to check out the mood of Saul. He's going to go to the royal court. There's going to be a dinner party, and David's not going to be there. And so he's going to see how Saul reacts. And we know what happens. Saul reacts badly. He says what he's going to do is he's going to come back, or they're going to meet at an appointed field, and Jonathan's going to fire 3 arrows. And he's going to call out to the boy that's with him. He's going to say, if he says the arrows are on that side of you, it's going to be safe. If he says the arrows are beyond you, then David is in trouble and he needs to flee. But we know what happens at the dinner party. Saul is very angry. Then Saul's anger was aroused against Jonathan, and he said to him, "You son of a perverse, rebellious woman. Do I not know that you have chosen the son of Jesse to your own shame and to the shame of your mother's nakedness? For as long as the son of Jesse lives on the earth, you shall not be established, nor your kingdom. Now therefore send and bring him to me, for he shall surely die." And this talk of Jonathan's mother's nakedness has caused a little bit of excitement as well. One commentator even suggesting that David had run off with Saul's wife, which is complete nonsense because there's absolutely no evidence of it. But apparently, in Hebrew, it's not that unusual a phrase. If we paraphrase what Saul is saying, he's saying, it's your mother's fault that you're the way you are, and you've been an embarrassment since you were born. And then, as seems to be the habit of Saul, Saul tries to kill Jonathan by throwing a spear. So then David and Jonathan go through the motions of the plan, because they're not supposed to be meeting just in case Saul's spies are watching. So Jonathan fires the arrows and says, they are beyond you, which means David has to flee. But then he sends the boy away and they meet up, which kind of defeats the purpose of the subterfuge of firing the arrows. And they say a very tearful farewell. And the two friends are never going to meet again. And it's interesting that it comments that David was more upset of the two of them. Why is that? Well, I think that's because Jonathan had adopted a fatalistic attitude. He knew that things were not going to end well for him and his father. And so he was accepting what was to come. And David becomes a fugitive, and he's pursued by Saul, who seems to be getting more and more, well, insane, really. He's quite clearly a manic depressive. He throws spears at people, but he ends up slaughtering priests. He ends up consulting with the occult. And he's pursuing David around his kingdom when he should have been looking after that kingdom. His job was to rule the people, to represent the people, to protect the people. Instead, he's trying to kill the most popular person in the kingdom. So the story ends with Saul and his three sons, including Jonathan, being killed by the Philistines on Mount Gilboa. And their bodies are fastened to the walls of Beth Shan, which was a major city at the time. And the men of Jabesh Gilead recover and cremate the bodies. And so the way is clear for David to be king. Please turn with me, if you would, to 2 Samuel chapter 1. 2 Samuel chapter 1 and verse 17. Then David lamented with this lamentation over Saul and over Jonathan his son, and he told them to teach the children of Judah the song of the bow. Indeed, it is written in the book of Jasher. The beauty of Israel is slain on your high places. How the mighty are fallen. Tell it not in Gath. Proclaim it not in the streets of Ashkelon, lest the daughters of the Philistines rejoice. Lest the daughters of the uncircumcised triumph. O mountains of Gilboa, let there be no dew nor rain upon you, nor fields of offering. For the shield of the mighty is cast away there, the shield of Saul, not anointed with oil. From the blood of the slain, from the fat of the mighty, the bow of Jonathan did not turn back, and the sword of Saul did not return empty. Saul and Jonathan were beloved and pleasant in their lives, and in their death they were not divided. They were swifter than eagles, they were stronger than lions. O daughters of Israel, weep over Saul, who clothed you in scarlet with luxury, who put ointments of gold on your apparel. How the mighty have fallen in the midst of battle. Jonathan was slain in your high places. I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. You have been very pleasant to me. Your love to me was wonderful, surpassing the love of women. How the mighty have fallen, and the weapons of war perished. So David says that Saul and Jonathan were not divided in death. They died together. But we know in life they certainly were divided. We think there was a big division when we first meet Jonathan. Certainly they were divided over Saul, over David, sorry. They were divided over David. David speaks about Jonathan's love being wonderful and surpassing the love of a woman. And if we're lucky, we can have a friend like that, can't we? We can have a confidant who we can talk to about our love life, a friend who doesn't judge us, a friend who is there for us through thick and thin, through whatever, a friend who the family might well not approve of, but it doesn't matter, a friend who their family might not approve of us. Again, it doesn't matter. Through thick and thin, they're a co-conspirator. So, what have we learned? Well, I've learned that when I'm selecting a subject to do a Bible class, I ought to check how many references there actually are about that person, because we don't really know that much about Jonathan. I think perhaps Saul would have been an easier choice. But when we look at Jonathan, we see a man of remarkable faith, a man who says, it doesn't matter to God whether he uses a lot of people or just a few people, he can still deliver his nation. A man who took David, the young David, under his wing and became his mentor. And when it became clear that David would supplant him, that David would take his place on the throne, his friendship didn't waver. It became clear that he was going to have to die, but he still remained steadfast in friendship to David. He accepted his faith. And we know that these two men of great faith, will be reunited when the Lord returns in the kingdom to come. Thank you.